Chapter 9. Madison dashed back to the cabin so she could cry because if someone saw her, there was no way to explain. It was irrational, stupid really, to feel so close to a man she'd only met 2 days before. They hadn't even spent all that much time together, but it felt like more because he'd occupied so much of her thoughts. Maisie raised an eyebrow as she rushed in. "Well, look at you all decked out in your Western finery." Madison looked down at her fitted t-shirt and jeans with boots that were a little too city to be country. "I was walking around a ranch. What do you want me to wear, stilettos?" Maisie had towed her last nerve. "I was thinking you might like to change into a swimsuit. Annabelle and I were walking out back and found this great little swimming hole. There's even some grass. We can lay out for a bit. Though you're pretty pale, maybe you don't do that?" She cocked her head and snapped her gum in challenge. Why did women like Maisie always make her feel inadequate, like she was back in high school stumbling over the right answers and avoiding everyone? "I've got a suit. Give me a minute to change." She just wouldn't tell Maisie that the stuff she'd be spraying on was sunscreen, not oil. Her swimsuit had been an afterthought, the thing she'd thrown into the side pouch of her bag at the last minute because she hadn't had a spare second to look at the Dawson Creek website to even see what they offered. She hadn't wanted to be the only one of the 4 to be without something to swim in. Now she knew that Danica probably would never sunbathe. Madison hadn't seen her friend all day and hoped that she'd found a quiet place to write. It's what she should have been doing instead of letting Maisie get to her. The little black bikini left her feeling quite exposed, but she'd forgotten a cover-up. As she shoved her sunscreen, sunglasses, book, notepad, and pen in a bag, she counted in her head all the reasons this was a bad idea. She knew the spot they were going. It was Randall's spot, and he might just need a minute alone. Walking in on a sunbathing Maisie wouldn't make him think of her, though. To prove her point, the curvy black-haired beauty emerged from the bathroom with a perfectly fitting white bikini that accentuated her deep tan. Her red lipstick fairly glowed against the bright white of her smile and the electric blue highlights in her hair. "Great! Annabelle is off with a guy she met at the bar last night. Danica is in the dining room writing. You and me? We're going to go catch some sun and talk contracts. Let's go." Contracts? What in the world could Maisie have in mind? They both knew her career had been floundering a bit. Her publisher had even considered dropping her, and her agent was dutifully searching for other options. It was possible Maisie had an in somewhere else, or she might just want Madison's slot on her publisher's roster. Within a few minutes, they found the little stream. It was wider in other areas, so Randall had called it a river. But right there, at that spot, it was a harmless little creek. Maisie dug out a huge towel and laid it over the grass, then sat down, digging yet again to find her suntan oil. Madison hesitated for a moment. Her whole body was on display, and laying out just made it a billboard. But shouldn't she want that? She'd be single her whole life if she didn't get someone to look. That was Maisie's theory, and it seemed to work. She was never far from men. Madison laid out her own towel and rubbed sunscreen over her legs, keeping careful eye on the bottle so Maisie never got a good look at it. Maisie ignored Madison and laid on her stomach. "Hurry and get that on so you and I can chat. I tend to fall asleep, so I'll set my phone alarm." If Madison fell asleep, she'd look like a boiled lobster. As she got situated on her own towel, Maisie started talking a mile a minute. "I know you're having trouble with your publisher, my agent told me. I think they are just not seeing sales. I've got a way to increase your sales again, and I'm even willing to do it for you. If we weren't friends, I never would. We need to co-write a story." Co-write? That's what new authors did to build a following, piggybacking on established authors, buying the name. What was Maisie insinuating? "I've already talked to my agent about doing a collection, and he said no. I doubt a co-authored book would be any different." Maisie closed her eyes and smiled, resting her chin on her wrists. "This isn't a collection, and you know it, Desiree. You need this to stay afloat. I bet no one here has even heard of you, but I'd bet money they've heard of me." Her lashes fluttered. "You should be grateful I'm willing to even consider it." "But my agent and my publisher wouldn't. I can't agree to anything without talking to them first. My publisher gets the right of first refusal on everything I write. Since we don't have the same publisher, how do you expect that will work? Maisie had been trying to move in on her publisher. They hadn't taken on new authors in a while, and Maisie was a big fish. The words stalled on her tongue at the sound of crunching grass and loose gravel behind her. Someone was coming, and she didn't have a thing to cover herself with. Hot embarrassment filled her from her toes to her hair. At least she was laying on her front, and whoever it was couldn't see her face. A shadow fell over her, and Madison cringed. Maisie giggled. "Hey, cowboy. Madison's lotion is there in her bag. I'm pretty sure she missed her shoulders. Wouldn't want her to burn, would you?" Madison glanced behind her, but didn't have to look far. She'd know those boots anywhere after she'd had them in her lap. Randall was standing over her. What would he think seeing her like that? That she wanted attention? That she was too pale to wear such a suit? Maybe he was so angry with her for lying to him and for not listening to him about staying out of the stable that he'd come to find her and confront her. "No, ma'am, I wouldn't want Madison to burn." She couldn't crane her neck enough to see him, and he didn't move forward. Then a light cotton shirt covered her that smelled like the very fibers were made for Randall. The scent of his aftershave clung to the collar. His hands hadn't lingered. He hadn't touched her at all. That was the cowboy way, too, to honor their women. Her daddy would have done just the same for her mama. And if her mama had needed help with lotion, he'd have done it, but in the privacy of their room, because she was modest, and he respected that. That was probably why they didn't kiss and touch in public, too. All this time, she'd attributed it to their chilly Christian nature, when it had to be that it was her father respecting his wife. Why hadn't she ever thought of that? "Randall!" she called as she flipped on the towel and sat up to see his retreating form, his muscled arms now bare, with just his sleeveless white tank showing off his broad back. She'd known those arms were strong, but to see them sent giddiness racing around in her belly. He was already yards away, but he stopped and turned back. That solemn look had returned to his face. But she couldn't let him leave, not after he'd found her like that. "I'm glad to see you up and about." He tipped his hat and turned back for the ranch, leaving her with words yet to say. The author and introvert insider, her who'd always run from interaction, now craved it. Maisie cleared her throat, and Madison turned to her. She'd almost forgotten about Maisie, even in the brief time since the woman had spoken. Her whole life, her reason for moving away from home could all be a lie. Somehow, Randall was the key. It took every effort to stay on that beach towel and not chase after him. Maisie gave her a needy glance. It was the most vulnerable Madison had ever seen her. She sat up and curled her legs in front of her in almost childlike weakness. "I've never had that happen, you know?" She paused for a breath, and her eyes filled with barely contained sorrow. "I hope you realize what you've got there, because most men don't do that. They aren't chivalrous. I should know. My whole adult life, I've flirted to get attention, wanting what he just gave you. I've said that kind of thing to more guys than you can imagine. Usually, not only do they have the bottle in hand, but the back of my suit unsnapped before I even finish speaking. Why did he do that for you?" Her blue eyes narrowed as she touched the hem of Randall's shirt. "And it isn't the clothes. Look at us. Other than the color, our suits are about the same." It would be easy to say that she'd never enticed him, but it would also be dishonest. She'd shared a saddle with him. You couldn't get much more enticing than that. "Randall would never do that to you. I think you're just inviting the wrong men to be with you. He's been nothing but a gentleman." "Just so you know, that's rare, even here. The guy I've been seeing this week isn't half that nice. If I were you, I'd be collecting his number and making sure he remembers you after this week, and never remembers any other woman." Madison huddled deeper into the soft shirt and inhaled deeply. If she gave in to her need to be with him, she'd have to come clean soon about who she was, and why they would always be worlds apart. Keeping his mind off Madison was near impossible. Seeing practically every curve on display had done something inside him. He wanted to protect her from prying eyes, even his own. Though he knew exactly what Luke expected of him, doing it was a lot harder than he'd ever thought. The easy route would have been to pick up that bottle of lotion and enjoy every moment of covering her back with it. But that would have led to the temptation to touch her more, and she wasn't his to touch. Now, waiting for her was an even bigger torture. He glanced across the empty pasture, remembering the morning roundup in her eyes, terrified, watching him. "Hey." A soft touch landed on his arm. He glanced down, and Madison smiled up at him. She didn't have his shirt with her. Part of him was purely smug that she wanted to keep it. "Hey." He wanted to open his stance, pull her to his chest, and tell her he was so glad she chose him over whatever else she could have done that evening. There had to be a bunch of other options for her that didn't involve standing outside in the dark, but where else could they go? "Thank you for earlier. After you left, Maisie and I had a really good talk about men. I understand her a lot more now. She's hurting and dealing with it in a very destructive way." So not doing what he'd wanted caused Miss Obvious to open up? "That so?" Madison nodded, wove her arm under his, and laid her head against his shoulder. Had she wanted to hold him as much as he wanted to take her into his arms? "She's always invited the wrong kind of attention and told me I better hold on to you with both hands." She tilted her head up to him and squeezed his arm, accentuating that she was holding on to him. "I guess I owe Maisie more than I thought." He pulled his arm free and draped it lightly over her shoulders, letting her come closer if she wanted. Madison tucked her arm around him as he held her close in the moonlight. She was perfect. "You going to tell me about you finally, or do I need to guess?" He'd seen his fair share of dishonest females, and while the trait ran equally among men and women, he needed her to be honest with him. If they had to start something with half a continent between them, they couldn't afford to keep secrets. She stiffened ever so slightly in his arms, but didn't pull away. "I told you the truth. I am a librarian in New York. What I didn't tell you, what I didn't think was important, was that when I lived in Kansas, it was on a horse ranch." He tightened his grip on her. "You didn't think that was important, since I obviously have no interest in horses." Was she worried he'd try to undercut her family? That he'd try to sell the same breed or steal clients? "I didn't think it was important because that isn't my life anymore. This is. I'm just a librarian from New York who wants to spend time with you before I have to go back to the noise." And he wanted to spend time with her more than he wanted to admit. "Just what do you and Maisie have to do with each other? She doesn't seem anything like you, and I can't figure out why you two would vacation together. And don't tell me she's a librarian." He laughed. He'd seen Maisie and the blonde leave earlier and turn toward Shady. They'd made it a habit, staying out much later than he wanted to be awake. Mostly because he didn't care. Madison wasn't with them. "That's a long story. We have a history. Can we leave it at that for now? There's a whole side to me that I'm not quite ready to share with you yet. I will, but it's so difficult when I'm not used to sharing anything with anyone." He nodded. "Do you have any idea how hard it was to let you walk out of the barn today, knowing that you thought I was being a jerk? And how hard it was to walk away after I'd finally found you to talk about it because you weren't alone?" Madison squeezed his middle and he closed his eyes, enjoying the feel of her. "I didn't think you were a jerk at all. I grew up in a stable. I know how dangerous it can be. I was just selfish, is all. I wasn't ready to leave you after you were hurt. I guess I didn't need to worry. You don't even have a limp." That was mostly due to all the ice he'd used in wrapping his ankle as soon as she'd left, not to mention they hadn't moved from that spot. After he'd walked to find her earlier, he'd had to ice it yet again. He wasn't about to admit it hurt, not to her. "I'm sure you've got other things to worry about." The night around them gave the illusion they were alone, even though they stood in the wide open in front of the pasture. He gave in to the temptation to run his hand up and down her arm as he held her. She sighed and tucked her head in closer. "I haven't felt this safe and this calm in... I can't remember how long." Calm? He was far from calm. Everyone always said redheads were trouble. He'd never believed it until now. "Happy to oblige." The silence grew between them. He wasn't sure if he should fill it or wait for her to speak. He looked down at her, and her eyes filled with thoughts, storms just waiting to burst. "Randall..." She backed from him a few inches and gazed into his eyes. Are we? The words died on her lips. How was he supposed to know what she was asking him? What were they? That was a good question, and one he couldn't readily take on. It was also one he wouldn't leave up to her to determine. That would be the coward's way out. He wanted to turn her in his arms and show her just what she was starting to mean to him, but there was a cavernous leap between holding a girl close and closing your lips on hers. Am I a man enjoying a night under the stars with a beautiful woman? Yes. Madison's hand moved from gripping his belt loop up to his chest, right over his heart. He couldn't much hide what she did to him with the evidence right under her palm. He caught it and pulled her wrist in for a kiss. The little gasp that escaped her lips was ecstasy. What happens when this week is over? Friday is rushing at me faster than I thought possible. It was only Monday, but he wasn't about to remind her of that. Friday would come soon enough without his help. Plus, Friday was only a morning. She'd be gone by noon. Only 3 more full days with her. What happens? Well, I guess I break my rules and start using that blasted phone they make me carry everywhere. Being reachable at every moment of the day wouldn't be quite so bad if it was Madison doing the reaching. Madison slid away from him, and he felt her absence immediately. I've never been one for talking on the phone either, but desperate times. She kissed the tips of her fingers and blew it at him as she backed away. He clutched the fence to keep from closing the expanding distance between them and tasting those lips for real, not just in his thoughts. Until tomorrow, little lady.